Hello Internet, in this video I am painting two different types of non-metallic metals using only a dry brush. Make sure to watch the whole video to find out the problems I have with the gold and how I fix them. Non-metallic metal is often looked at as this god tier painting technique that most of us feel is unattainable. But what if I were to tell you that you could get a decent looking tabletop ready NMM using only a dry brush? Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, in this video I'm going to show you how I do exactly that with both steel and gold. I'm going to start with the steel, as it is the one I have done before and am fairly confident in. Now, due to the nature of applying the paint with a dry brush, the finish will not be super smooth. Instead, we will be getting a fairly dull and weathered looking steel, which is perfect for these skeleton lads. As the key to achieving a metallic looking surface is super high contrast, I'm going to be priming my models in black. This will ensure that the shadows are the darkest possible colour. The first paint I use is Dark Sea Blue by Vallejo. This is a firm favourite of mine when it comes to painting fantasy models. I'm not sure what it is, but I generally find myself reaching for this paint for base coats a lot. In this case it is useful as we want to have a little bit of blue in our metallic colour. This is so that it isn't just a journey from black through grey to white, as not only is that simply boring, but it may also appear more like stone than metal. When applying this first colour I am pretty generous and not very careful in my application, as I wanted to cover most of the surface area. The next paint I use is Fenrisian Grey. Despite the name, this paint has a definite blue tint that will help to introduce blue like I previously spoke about. When getting this on my brush, I worked it into the bristles on top of the area where I had removed the Dark Sea Blue. I did this to mix the two colours, which would make the contrast between the layers a little softer. When putting the paint on the Mini, I tried to use a downwards motion. I also made sure that when painting the chest piece and shield, I focused on half of the surface area to help push the contrast between light and dark. Again, I was a little heavy-handed with the application, but this time I kinda paid for it. Once I am happy with the coverage of that layer, I use Fenrisian Grey again, but this time I use a clean portion of kitchen roll when working it into the bristles. As you can see, my approach to applying these different layers of dry brushing is the same as when I paint something like skin. Mixing the colours between changes really helps the transition to be smoother. Again, I make sure to use downward motion and only apply it to the areas that I applied the previous layer, but cover a smaller area. Next I use a white, which I apply in the patch of clean Fenrisian Grey on the paper. After doing this layer I will be doing a layer of clean white, so as you can see you only need 3 colours, or 4 if you include the primer, to achieve this dull non-metallic steel. I thought it may be a good idea to try my hand at gold using the same technique, but with different colours to the steel. Just like before, we're going to be starting with a heavier base coat of a fairly dark colour. In this case, it's Rhinox Hide, which again is one of my staple colours, one I come back to time and time again. There's a lot more metal on the Stormcast Eternal than there was on the skeleton, so I end up using a bit more paint. It's crazy that I've been doing this hobby for as long as I have now, and I am only just painting my first Stormcast Eternal. The next colour I use is Scrag Brown, as it's quite a light brown that is starting to lean towards the yellow and red in the colour wheel. Just like before, we want to be picking up a little of the last paint as well to mix the layers. Remember, when applying these paints you want to pick a direction to pull your brush and stick to it. The next colour I use is Avalon Sunset as we start to transition into the yellows. I choose a fairly dark base yellow as it isn't too different to the Scrag Brown in terms of value. The transition between the two won't seem too stark. However, I'm not entirely happy with how this paint went on. My version of this paint is quite liquidy, which meant on the larger, flatter areas of the model there was a bit of a streaky finish. But hopefully this is something I can sort out by the end. The next colour I use is Ice Yellow. Initially I thought this would be my last colour, my brightest point. However, it left the whole thing looking quite desaturated, as it is a really cold yellow that is quite close to white. In order to fix it, I sadly had to step away from my dry brush. So I guess my experiment to dry brush gold NMM kind of failed. However, this is still quite an easy version of gold NMM, which I would urge you to try. In order to make the Stormcast armour look more like gold than this weird pale colour, I put some Sun Yellow by Vallejo Game Colour on my wet palette. I imagine any bright rich yellow like Uriel Yellow for instance would work. I then added a few drops of water to get the paint to the consistency of a wash. I could then use this thin paint to tint all of the armour and reintroduce the yellow. It was almost like applying a filter to a picture on your phone, but in this case on the model. I did a couple layers of the paint in order to get the saturation I was happy with. Once it was all looking a bit more yellow, there was another problem. All the darkest browns were no longer that dark. So to fix this, I mixed a little bit of white spirits with a dark umber and black oil paint. Creating an oil wash would mean that I could darken the recesses whilst leaving the surface that nice yellow colour we had just achieved. If you'd like to see a video on how to do oil washes, make sure to let me know in the comments below. So we have our darkest points back, but we have still lost our brightest points. So I do another dry brush of Ice Yellow, but this time I am very careful not to overdo it, making sure to aim for only the top parts of each component. This way we are not smothering the colour work that we have done underneath, and you still get the transition from warm, dark browns to a light, colder yellow. Whilst I could leave it here, I decided to increase the contrast a little bit more by taking out a detail brush and doing some edge highlighting with pure white. Not only does this increase the contrast, which helps to suggest the reflective nature of the metallic areas, but it also helps to clearly define the different pieces of armour by creating a clear end point to each panel. With that, I am willing to call this gold done. I know that the gold didn't end up being dry brush only, but I think the few steps I added was still fairly simple, so it's ideal for anybody who wants to do some gold that isn't super shiny. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel or watching more of the videos we have here. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.